Summer always had a way of exposing things. The cracks in the sidewalk, the dust on the windowsill, the silence in a house that used to be filled with voices. My name is Claire. I'm 49. Married. One daughter, grown and gone, off chasing her life on the other coast. My husband, Todd, works long hours at a firm downtown, and when he gets home he's more in love with his laptop than the sound of my voice. I tell people I'm content. I tell myself that too. Until the day he came home. Ethan had been gone for 4 years, off at college, then doing something tech-related in Denver. He used to mow lawns around the neighborhood as a teenager, lanky and quiet, polite in the way boys are when their mothers are watching. But the man who stepped out of the car last Saturday? He wasn't a boy anymore. He was taller now. Broader. Sun-kissed skin, forearms that suggested work, not just weights. His eyes, still that soft green but older somehow. Sharper. I watched from my kitchen window as he carried his suitcase across the driveway next door, laughing with his father, who still wore the same sandals and baseball cap every summer. And then, as if sensing me, Ethan turned and looked directly into my window, right at me. He didn't wave, didn't nod, just held my gaze for a second longer than politeness required. It was subtle, easy to explain away, but something inside me fluttered, low and unwanted, a flicker I hadn't felt in years. I stepped back from the window like I'd done something wrong. I hadn't, of course. He was just my neighbor's son. The kid who used to ask if he could borrow our hedge clippers. The one I once gave a ride home when it started to rain. Nothing more. Except, when I saw him again that evening, standing at the fence, drink in hand, leaning on one hip like he'd always belonged there. He looked at me again. And this time he smiled. Not the grin of a neighbor. Not the smirk of a boy. But the quiet, slow smile of a man who sees a woman. And in that split second, forgot how to breathe. The next evening, I was watering the tomatoes when I heard his voice. Didn't take you for a gardener. I turned. Ethan stood on the other side of the fence, a beer in one hand, his shirt sleeves rolled, that smile still hovering like he knew something I didn't. Only when the mood strikes, I replied, brushing a strand of hair from my face. Which is almost never, to be honest. He laughed. Low. Warm. You always seemed more elegant than dirt under the nails. It was a strange thing to say, honest, unfiltered. But not rude. Just watching me a little too closely. I turned back to the hose, trying to slow the thud in my chest. You've grown up. 4 years'll do that. You look different. He raised an eyebrow. Is that your way of saying I don't look like a kid anymore? I met his eyes. And for a second I didn't see the boy who used to ride his bike past our house. I saw a man. And worse, I saw myself being seen as a woman. Not a neighbor. Not someone's wife. But a woman. I looked away too quickly. How's your mom? She's good. Same as always. Still makes too much pie when she's nervous. I used to love her cherry pie. He smiled again. She's making one tomorrow. You should come by. She'd love to see you. I nodded too fast. Maybe. A breeze passed between us, lifting the scent of wet soil and something else. Something electric and invisible. Ethan leaned on the fence post, arms crossed. You know, he said, his tone suddenly softer. I used to think you were the most beautiful woman in the neighborhood. I froze. My hand still dripping from the hose, my heartbeat louder than the wind. He smiled like it was a secret he'd been waiting years to tell. You were always kind to me, he added. But you never really saw me. I swallowed. You were a boy. He tilted his head, eyes steady. And what am I now? That question hung between us, heavy, dangerous, tempting. I didn't answer. Because I couldn't lie. And the truth would have cracked the ground beneath my feet. I told myself it was just neighborly. A visit. Thank you. A bite of cherry pie I hadn't tasted in years. I even wore something casual, jeans, a soft linen blouse, flats. Nothing too careful. Nothing that said I stood in front of the mirror and changed twice. But I had. When I stepped through their back door, the house smelled like sugar and cinnamon and childhood. Ethan's mother, Mary Ann, greeted me with flour on her cheek and a warm hug. We sat in the kitchen like old friends. She asked about my daughter, my work, if Todd still had that weird obsession with model trains. I laughed, nodded, played my part. But my eyes kept drifting. To the hallway. The clink of a bottle. The low murmur of Ethan's voice in the other room. When he finally walked in, my breath caught. White t-shirt. Barefoot. Hair still damp from a shower. He looked like something out of a memory I didn't know I had permission to keep. Marianne cut generous slices of pie and poured tea. But after a few minutes she excused herself, something about checking the laundry. And then it was just us. Sitting at the old oak table. Forks. Crumbs. Silence. He leaned back in his chair, watching me with that unflinching ease that only young men seem to have. The kind that says, "I'm not afraid of what this is." "You like it?" he asked. "The pie." I replied too quickly. He smirked. "Sure. The pie. It's good. Like I remember." He nodded, then added softly, "You look different too." I didn't respond. He reached across the table, casually brushing his finger along the side of my hand, not holding it, not even touching it fully, just tracing a line I hadn't realized I was drawing between us. I pulled my hand back. Slowly. Politely. As if the air hadn't just thickened with something heavier than sugar. "You should be careful, Ethan." "With what?" I met his eyes. "With this." He smiled again. Not mocking. Not immature. Just knowing. "I'm not a kid anymore, Claire. You know that." I stood then, thanking him for the pie, for the invitation, for the nostalgia. But as I reached the door, he followed me. And in the quiet space of the threshold, he said it. "You used to look at me like I was invisible. Now you look like you're afraid of me." I turned. Slowly. "I'm not afraid of you," I whispered. "I'm afraid of what you see." And before he could answer, I walked out into the night. But the truth followed me home. Because in one evening, one slice of cherry pie, I tasted something far more dangerous than sweetness. Being wanted. I couldn't sleep that night. The house was too quiet. My bed too cold. Todd had taken to sleeping in the downstairs guest room when his snoring got bad, which lately was most nights. I stepped outside just past midnight. Barefoot. Wrapped in a thin cardigan. The air smelled like damp soil in late summer, thick with memory. The garden bench sat beneath the jasmine tree, the one Ethan's father had planted years ago when the boys were still little. I used to sit there with a glass of wine and watch fireflies while my daughter played with sidewalk chalk. It had been years. But that night the bench wasn't empty. Ethan was there. I froze, half hidden by shadow, heart suddenly pounding in my throat. He didn't see me at first. He was looking up at the stars maybe, or lost in thought. A book sat next to him unread. His body relaxed, one leg stretched, long fingers laced together in his lap. He looked like he belonged there, and somehow like he was waiting. I should have turned back. Should have gone inside, blamed the cool air, the hour, the ache in my chest that hadn't stopped since that damn slice of pie. But instead I stepped forward. He heard the shift of gravel beneath my feet, turned, said nothing, just moved over, a quiet invitation. I sat beside him, careful not to let our bodies touch. We stared straight ahead. Not speaking. Not needing to. The night hummed with crickets and distant sprinklers. His presence warmed the inches between us like sunlight still clinging to a windowsill after dusk. "You couldn't sleep either?" I finally asked. He shook his head. Then after a beat, "You always sit like that when you're nervous." I looked down. My fingers were twisting the edge of my sleeve unconsciously. "You noticed that?" He smiled. "I notice everything about you." The words should have made me recoil. Instead, they settled into my skin like something I hadn't realized I'd been missing. "Ethan," I began. But he turned slowly, deliberately, and this time there was no boy in his face. Just a man. A man who saw me as a woman. Not someone's wife. Not someone's mom. Not the quiet neighbor with a kind smile and tired eyes. But me. His hand brushed mine. Light as a whisper. Testing gravity. I didn't move. Because part of me was still trying to remember why I ever stopped wanting to be seen. And as the stars burned above us and the jasmine bloomed heavy and sweet between our shadows, I realized something far more dangerous than desire. I didn't want the night to end. The next morning, I told myself it hadn't meant anything. That garden benches and jasmine trees had a way of making things feel more romantic than they were. That I was tired. Vulnerable. That I'd let the quiet fill with imagination. But even as I poured my coffee and stared out the kitchen window, I could still feel it. his fingers on my wrist. Not possessive, not accidental, intentional. Just a brush, skin to skin, like punctuation at the end of a sentence neither of us could say aloud. Todd was already gone for the day. A full docket in court meetings back to back. I doubt he noticed I hadn't slept. I doubt he would have asked. And yet Ethan had known. Without a word. Without a glance. He knew. I stayed inside most of the day. Distracted. Cleaning things that didn't need to be cleaned. Rearranging a shelf I'd left untouched for years. Trying to keep my hands busy when my thoughts were anything but. That evening, just as the sun dipped low behind the oaks lining our cul-de-sac, there was a knock at the back door. Ethan. He wore a gray t-shirt and jeans. Casual. Effortless. But his eyes, those steady green eyes, they were anything but casual. He held something in his hand. I thought you might want this back, he said. It was my garden trowel. I must have left it on the side of the house. Thanks, I replied, voice thinner than I intended. He handed it to me but didn't let go right away. His fingers lingered over mine. Warm. Present. And then he spoke, low and certain. Tell me to stop, Claire. If you want me to stop, say it now. I opened my mouth but nothing came. Because the word wasn't there. Because I didn't want it to stop. And he knew it. His thumb brushed the inside of my wrist again, slower this time. The same spot as the night before. It was barely a touch. A breath. A pause. But it unraveled something in me I'd spent years knotting tight. I stepped back just an inch. He didn't follow. He just looked at me like he could already feel the heat of that inch between us. I don't want to make trouble for you, he said. You're not, I whispered. You're married. I know. He waited. Gave me time to reclaim the air between us. To build a wall if I needed to. But I didn't. Instead, I looked at him and said something I hadn't even said to myself out loud. I haven't felt anything in years. Not like this. His breath caught. Not from surprise, but from recognition. I never stopped looking at you, he said. And this time it was me who stepped forward. Just slightly. Just enough. Because the world hadn't tilted yet. But it would. And when it did, it would start with the memory of his thumb on my wrist. It happened on a Thursday. A quiet golden hour kind of day, where everything seemed too soft, too still. Like the world was holding its breath. I had just come in from the garden when I saw him again. Ethan. Leaning against the fence with one hand gripping the wood. Like he'd been waiting, or pacing. Or trying to decide if this was a terrible idea. Maybe it was. But some terrible ideas feel more true than the ones we build our lives around. He didn't speak at first. Just watched me. And I watched him. It was the kind of silence that has a heartbeat. I moved to pour myself a glass of water. Something normal, something grounding. But my hand shook just enough to spill a little across the counter. He noticed. Of course he did. I don't want to be a mistake you regret, he said finally. I turned slowly. And I don't want to keep pretending I don't feel what I feel when you're near me. The words felt foreign in my mouth. Like they belonged to another version of myself, braver and younger. But they were mine. Raw. Honest. He stepped closer. Not fast. Not assuming. But deliberately, like he was giving me every second to turn away. I didn't. When he reached me, he didn't touch me right away. He just stood there, close enough that I could feel the warmth of him. His voice was low. Almost reverent. Claire. If I kiss you right now, everything changes. I nodded. I know. A breath passed between us. And then, his hand rose, fingertips grazing my jaw. Not possessive. Not forceful. Just certain. I leaned in. Or maybe he did. Or maybe we both met in the middle. In that invisible space where everything we'd swallowed finally spilled over. His lips touched mine. Slow. Careful. Devastating. Like he was memorizing the shape of a decision. And I kissed him back like I'd forgotten every reason not to. Time unraveled. Nothing else existed. Not the houses on either side. Not the porch light still glowing behind us. Not the 30 years of marriage clinging to my ring finger like a fading promise. Only his mouth. Only my hands finally unclenched. Only this, the truth I'd buried for far too long blooming all at once in the shape of a kiss I never imagined I'd want, and now couldn't imagine ever forgetting. When we finally broke apart, our foreheads stayed pressed together. Neither of us spoke. There was no need. The silence said everything. We'd crossed the line, and it felt terrifyingly like home. Todd was out of town. A legal conference in San Diego. 3 nights for days. He barely looked up from his laptop when he told me. I left the itinerary on the fridge, he said, not noticing that I hadn't asked for it. And just like that, the house was mine. Empty. Quiet. Open. The first night I didn't expect to see Ethan. I didn't plan anything. I even poured a glass of wine and curled up with an old book, telling myself I'd imagined it all. The kiss, the look in his eyes, the way my body still buzzed with the memory of his hands. But around 10 p.m. there was a knock at the back door. He didn't wait for me to open it. I think he knew I would. He stood there, not tentative, not bold. Just real. No plan. No lies. I couldn't stop thinking about you, he said. I stepped aside, and he came in. It wasn't like the movies. There was no rushed heat, no tangled clothing on the stairs. Instead, it was quiet. Intentional. He sat beside me on the couch, the space between us shrinking with every breath. We talked first. About nothing. About everything. His job. My daughter. What it felt like to be seen in a world that keeps telling you to shrink. Then, somewhere between midnight and confession, he reached for my hand. I let him take it. This time I didn't pull away. And when he leaned in slower than slow like he was giving me a chance to stop him, I didn't. His kiss was deeper this time. Less question. More answer. I brought him upstairs. To my room. The room I shared with a man who hadn't touched me in nearly a year. The bed where I'd memorized the ache of loneliness lying next to a body that didn't notice mine. But this wasn't about betrayal. Not really. It was about being chosen. Being wanted. Being held. Not as a memory or a duty, but as something alive. And when Ethan traced his fingers along my bare shoulder in the dark, whispering my name like it meant something, I didn't feel ashamed. I felt awake. For the first time in years, I felt like my skin belonged to me. By the time Monday arrived, the house looked the same. The sheets were clean. The dishes were put away. There was no trace of him, at least not on the surface. But inside me, everything had changed. I stood at the kitchen counter that morning, coffee in hand, staring blankly at the neighbor's yard. His yard. The bench we'd sat on. The fence he'd leaned against. The door he walked through like it wasn't a sin. My husband returned late the night before. He'd kissed my cheek absently, told me about his flight delay, then collapsed into bed without noticing the scent of someone else still folded in the air I hadn't yet exhaled. And now the routine resumed. Toast. News. Laundry. Except I wasn't the same. I saw Ethan briefly that morning. He was standing on his parents' porch, speaking with his mother, laughing about something, carefree in a way I envied. Like the world hadn't shifted. Like the night hadn't happened. But then for just a moment he looked up. And I knew. He hadn't forgotten. Not a single second. Our eyes met across the space of our 2 houses, and it felt like time rippled. Not dramatic. Not urgent. Just real. The way real things are when they're too heavy to say aloud. Later, I passed him in the driveway while bringing out the trash. He didn't speak. Neither did I. But as we passed, his fingers brushed mine. Just once. Just enough to remind me that I was still in this. That we both were. And that pretending otherwise wouldn't make it go away. The day crawled by. I went through the motions like a woman underwater, smiling when spoken to, folding towels with fingers that remembered the shape of his skin. Every ordinary thing felt sharp. Too bright. Too loud. Too fake. And when Todd came home that evening and asked what was for dinner, I nearly laughed. Because I'd forgotten I still had a life to perform. But later, in the stillness of our bedroom, I lay beside him with my eyes wide open, staring into the dark, heart echoing with a truth I couldn't speak. I didn't regret it. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Because when Ethan kissed me, I remembered who I was before the world told me to settle down and disappear. And some memories, once unlocked, don't go quietly. It happened on a Wednesday. I'd gone to the corner market, the one just a few blocks away where everyone knows everyone and the cashier still bags your produce with a smile. I wasn't thinking about him. Not at first. I was focused on kale. Or maybe lemons. Something ordinary to anchor me in the kind of normal I hadn't felt in days. And then I turned the corner. And there he was, Ethan, leaning against the juice cooler in a dark green hoodie, his hair slightly damp, like he'd just come from a run or a shower or something between. Our eyes locked before either of us had a chance to look away. He smiled, small, private, meant only for me. And something inside me moved. Not shame, not fear, but that quiet, hot ache that comes from being wanted in a room full of people who don't know a thing about you. I looked away, pretended to read the label on a bottle I didn't need, tried to remind myself where I was, who I was, what this could cost. But he didn't move. He just stood there waiting. When I finally approached the checkout lane, he slipped behind me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of him at my back. "Claire," he whispered, low enough for only me to hear. "Come outside." "I can't," I said quickly. "Someone might." "I don't mean here." His voice was calm, steady. "I mean this weekend. Just you and me. Away from all of this." My heart skipped. "Ethan." "No pressure," he said gently. "Just a cabin I know. Quiet. Safe. One night. Just space to breathe." I didn't answer. Not out loud. But when the cashier handed me my bag, and I turned to leave, I brushed his hand with mine, barely, softly, and let my fingers linger a second too long. An answer without a word. That night, Todd sat beside me on the couch watching the news. He asked if I wanted tea, if I'd remembered to pick up eggs. I nodded, smiled, said the right things, but inside something was already packing itself into a suitcase. Not guilt, not escape, but desire. The kind that doesn't just want to be touched. It wants to be understood. We left just after dusk. No suitcase, just a weekend bag and the silence between us, full of things we didn't have to say anymore. The cabin was 2 hours north, hidden behind old pine and the soft hush of a lake that reflected everything you were afraid to see in daylight. Ethan drove. I watched the road, the trees, the way the sky dimmed in slow, silver gradients. When we arrived, it was already dark. He lit a fire, made tea, turned on music so soft it felt like breath. There was no rush, no grabbing or gasping or pretending it wasn't everything we'd both imagined 100 different ways. Instead, we just sat, two people on either side of a room, looking at the space that used to hold fear. Now it held truth. He came to me slowly, kissed me gently, touched me like I was something new, not because I was, but because he made me feel that way. When he undressed me, it wasn't with hunger. It was with awe. And when I touched him, I didn't think of right or wrong. I thought only of being alive, of breathing in time with someone who saw me before I ever said a word. We stayed up most of the night, whispered things we never said out loud, laughed, fell asleep with our legs tangled, our bodies warm from both firelight and honesty. But the sunrise, it changed something. I woke up before him, sat at the edge of the bed, watching the sky grow pink over the lake. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel torn. I just felt still, whole. I knew what I had to do, not because I owed anyone an explanation, but because I'd found something I didn't want to hide anymore. I drove home alone. Todd was at work. The house felt smaller somehow, dimmer. I sat at the kitchen table and wrote him a letter. Not full of apologies, not confessions, just truth. I told him I'd forgotten how to feel, that someone reminded me, and that I wasn't sorry for remembering. When Ethan came by that evening, I opened the door and smiled. I told him, I said. He didn't ask what came next. He didn't ask anything at all. He just took my hand and held it like he knew exactly how much it cost me to be brave. And that was how it ended. Not in chaos, not in shame, but in clarity. Sometimes the most dangerous love is the one that reminds you who you are.